Today we're going to be analysing Gathering Leaves by Robert Frost, and to quickly go over what happens in this poem, it's really simple. It's just describing the process of gathering leaves, which is an essential part of the harvest, but it's one that the man who we are following gets no gratification from, and he's just complaining about it. This poem could be described as ranting, unsatisfied, tired, wearied, repetitive, monotonous, fast-paced, disappointed, pointless, bitter, frustrated, cynical. Okay, so let's jump right in and go through this poem line by line. Spades take up leaves no better than spoons, and bags full of leaves are light as balloons. So what the narrator is basically saying in the first two lines is that spades are insufficient. So that tells us that he's doing some hard work. It's also unsatisfying because he has nothing but a weightless bag to show for all his work. This stanza also immediately sets up a cynical tone for the poem because it opens the whole thing on a complaint, and it uses the negative word no in line 2. I make a great noise of rustling all day, like rabbit and deer running away. All day tells us a little bit more about the job at hand because we learn that the narrator has been doing it for a long time, and he compares it to a deer chasing a rabbit, and I think this kind of comes across as this endless hunt or an endless chase, and that makes the job come across as never ending as well. I think this is also an interesting image because the rabbit and deer are running away from responsibility, unlike the narrator, because he's tied down by the fact that humans are trying to fight with nature. You know, he's trying to gather up all these leaves, whereas other creatures don't try and fight with nature. They can just roam through it. That's kind of a contrast that I thought Frost might be going for there. But the mountains I raise elude my embrace, flowing over my arms and into my face. This is my favourite stanza of the poem, and I think this image just does so much. It says so many things. So Frost really effectively gets across the imagery with the word embrace, because you can totally imagine the speaker carrying a pile of leaves like he's hugging them. And then them all flowing out of his arms. Also, the words mountains I raise is a really powerful image, and it kind of portrays the narrator as godlike, but his superiority over nature is just superficial and doesn't last long because it slips through his fingers just as the leaves do. Raising mountains also sounds really difficult, so the speaker is putting so much time and effort into gathering these leaves, but still they're unyielding. So we do kind of get the sense that he would be really frustrated by this. Another thing I like about this imagery is that it compares the leaves to mountains, where previously they were weightless, and then later on they're flowing like a river. And I think this just really portrays the power of nature, because it can be like anything at any time. It contradicts itself with its own diversity, if that makes sense. I may load and unload again and again till I fill the whole shed. And what have I then? Next to nothing for weight, and since they grew duller from contact with earth, next to nothing for colour. Next to nothing for use, but a crop is a crop, and who's to say where the harvest shall stop? Again, the unsatisfying monotony of the job at hand and the speaker's impatience and frustration at this is portrayed a lot in these lines. There's a repetition of next to nothing and of again and again, and there's also rhetorical questions, which I think portray this really well. But I think we should note that he says next to nothing. He doesn't say they're absolutely useless. Farmers use dead leaves for background jobs, such as protecting other plants from frost and making compost. And I think that the fact that the narrator doesn't just say leaves have no use is him sort of accepting that he is less powerful than nature. It's not for him to decide, it's for nature to decide. And nature has this intrinsic value. A crop is a crop, so he has to farm it as a farmer. Another interesting thing is how the leaves grow duller from their contact with the earth, and this is really similar to a description in Frost's poem After Apple Picking, in which apples hit the ground and are deemed worthless. So I think that's just a cool link to make. He's saying in both poems that nature is pure until it comes down to earth where we humans dwell. Now, if we look at the conclusion, we have to think that this person has spent the whole poem describing the labor of his task and how useless the leaves are, but nature gets the last word. The end line states that this is an essential part of the harvest, so the speaker is powerless to the life that he must lead. And I think he's kind of governed by the higher laws of nature and nature's power over him. And as I said, the rhetorical question at the end portrays his frustration at this. Next, let's have a look at the form of this poem. So it has a really whimsical rhythm, and I haven't been able to tie it down to any particular type of meter. So I think this is quite a good example of Frost's sound of sense philosophy in writing poetry, which is basically that he guides his verse with the rhythms of actual human speech and not necessarily with formal poetry techniques. So this poem to me really sounds like this man ranting. Then there's a lot of devices used to get across effects. So he uses repetition and rhetorical questions to display the speaker's frustration and their tiredness and their dissatisfaction. Then he uses enjambment to prolong the time before the questions are answered, which gives more weight to them, and also kind of again displays the monotony of the work and how it just goes on and on and on. Then he engages a lot of our senses. He engages the ears with some onomatopoeia and describing sounds. Then he engages our eyes by describing mountains and colours, and also the feeling of the leaves flowing over his arms and, painfully hitting him in the face. To me, though, the most powerful and the most recurrent device in this poem is contrast. Frost just uses contrast and juxtaposition all over the place in this poem. So if you're looking for a poem that shows contrast, this is the one. So let's explore this. There is an informal register for most of the poem, and I think that makes the really formal phrase, "elude my embrace," quite striking. Then there's tons of contrasting similes and metaphors. So there's the spades compared with the spoons, which are obviously a lot smaller than them. I think we all know that spades and spoons are pretty different. There's the rabbit and deer running away, which is a really, wild and racing picture. And that's compared to the narrator being stuck in just gathering leaves, which is quite boring and quite pointless. Then there's the picture of mountains, which is kind of what the narrator wants the leaves to be. He's like, I want this to have meaning, so I want to be raising mountains, but they flow through his fingers like a river. So there's kind of a contrast there in what the narrator, a human, wants and what nature is actually. Then there is the bags, which are full, but they're like balloons, which obviously are empty and weightless. And then these ones aren't metaphors or similes, but they are use of contrasting language, so I thought I would mention them. He says that he filled the whole shed, but then in the next line he says, "What have I then?" He just, he fills an entire shed and then he says, I have nothing. And then there is connotations of love in the use of the word embrace. But then that's contrasted with connotations of hate in how the leaves slash back at the narrator into his face. There's also contrast in the structure of the poem in quite a few different ways. So it's really concise, which is unlike this meandering and endless task that we are describing. It's fast-paced with short words and long sentences, unlike the obviously slow work that the narrator is doing. And it has this kind of joyous rhythm, I think, because of the rhymes, and it's just kind of set out like a song, which obviously contrasts with the narrator's frustration. Moving on to themes, the first theme I want to talk about is pointlessness. So this is displayed through the narrator thinking that the hard work he's doing has no worth. Yet he has to do it. He has to collect the leaves because it's not in his power to say when the harvest will stop. And he seems pretty bitter about this. So let's go a bit deeper into how the theme of pointlessness is displayed in this poem. The words next to nothing are said repeatedly throughout the poem, and rhetoric questions are also used. And I think that kind of demonstrates how the narrator is not going to get any rewards from this work, therefore it's pointless. Or he's going to get next to no rewards, we should say. Then there's imagery displaying how inefficient this job is throughout the poem. There's the spades, which are as good as spoons. There's the leaves, which as soon as he picks them up, they just flow out of his hands. He also compares the hard labor to mountains that he's raising, which is obviously a grand picture, but it just comes crumbling down, and him enjoying the fruits of his labor eludes him. Later in the poem, he kind of rants that the leaves have no value, not in beauty, not in substance, not in function. And I think just in the subject matter of this poem, you already get a sense of pointlessness, because gathering leaves is not a useful task, and it never ends because the leaves will always fall. There'll always be more leaves coming. Secondly, there is the theme of nature, more specifically the power of nature, because I think we know by this point that Robert Frost loves talking about how powerful nature is. And to be honest, I love talking about him talking about how powerful nature is, but that's beside the point. So, the power of nature is shown in the fact that everything in nature has an intrinsic value. Even these leaves, which the narrator continuously says are so useless, because a crop is a crop. Also, in the last stanza, the narrator says, "Who's to say where the harvest shall stop?" Which suggests that humans can't define their own harvest. It's under nature's control, and therefore nature has the power over humans. The man tries to exert power over nature by saying that he has raised mountains like this god. And I think that's a really powerful image, because when we think about power over nature and the ability to move mountains and shape the earth, we do think of gods being able to do that. But the narrator's power is superficial, and he doesn't get any satisfaction from it after all. Then his monotonous work is juxtaposed with the image of the rabbit and the deer freely roaming through nature. So I think this makes a point that other creatures don't try to fight with nature, and so they escape from responsibility and from monotony and from the frustration that the narrator is feeling. And finally, contradictory images are used to display the diverse strength of nature, and in particular, I really like this. Throughout this really short poem, we see nature as likened to balloons, which are weightless, compared to mountains, which are epic and huge and colossal and powerful and towering, but it's also flowing like a river, like something effortless and beautiful. So yes, nature is undeniably a really powerful force in this poem. I'm going to finish this off by discussing some possible interpretations for this poem, because it might just be about gathering leaves, but that might be a metaphor for something else. The first interpretation is that the leaves represent superficial possessions, so the never ending harvest represents our addiction to materialism. These possessions are of no real worth, they are light as balloons, and we just waste time in procuring them all day. We spend all our time shopping and thinking about what we want next. There is a grand description of the mountains that we raise, which alludes to our attempts at making ourselves feel important or complete using material possessions. But really, this is superficial and they elude our embrace, or they don't let us enjoy them. And finally, the narrator says they grew duller from contact with the earth, which I think means that objects become less interesting once you own them, or when they go out of style. Another possible interpretation is that this is a pessimistic look at life in general. So the leaves could represent memories, and the gathering of them is our attempt to give meaning to life. It's hard and laborious work that is pointless. But this way of living, trying to harvest the good times, is the only way that we know. So we keep doing it. I think that Robert Frost could be suggesting that we only labor over things that are truly valuable. So going with the metaphor, it would be the real substantial rewards of a harvest, not the not very useful leaves, which might represent, just insignificant or superficial things in our lives that we try so hard to find meaning in, even though they might be devoid of color, which could represent interest or a kind of refreshing unfamiliarity, weight or a deep meaning, and use, an actual function that will progress our lives.